85% of Iranians are against the regime, and they've been protesting and fighting for freedom for years.
But nowadays, I'm starting to see from a lot of conservatives, from a lot of other people who are pundits on television, who are having or displaying what I believe is true anti-Semitism.
Where we are right now is so scary because it mimics exactly every pattern in history before the worst case scenario. It's the same thing that happened in Nazi Germany. And so because the Western world has no idea who the Islamic Republic are and what their objective is, they look at this war in Gaza, which is obviously devastating. It's obviously horrible. So many innocent lives lost, but they don't understand why this is happening. They don't understand that Hamas is intentionally burying itself in civilian populations. They don't understand that this is a war that's very existential, not just for Israel, but for the Middle East and the world.
You guys, welcome to the show, Elica Le Bon. I had you all mixed up, right? I thought you were a devout Muslim, and I was in before the show. I said, "Hey, I just want you to know I'm very critical of Islam." And what you said to me, I said, "Oh my God, this is going to be an incredible interview." But I was wrong about you being a devout Muslim, and that's probably why you gave me the response you gave me. But welcome to the show, by the way. And I want you to talk about this real quick because I am very critical of Islam, and I will be honest about it. I'm very critical from the outside looking in. I have never been, I don't know anybody really that's Muslim. I don't know anybody that's actually practicing Islam seriously. And so me being critical of the dangers of Islam, what is your thoughts on that? Being, you know, I guess your heritage is Islamic. So what's your thoughts on that?
So let me just say from the beginning that, you know, I'm from Iran, and our original faith, I guess you could say native faith of the land, was Zoroastrianism, which is a very, very old religion. And then I guess around 1400 years ago, Iran was subjected to these Islamic conquests where many Iranians either voluntarily or were forcibly converted to Islam. So that's how Islam comes to Iran. It was through conquest, it was through expansion and all of that stuff. You know, one of the main problems when people talk about, you know, when you are critical of Islam and people say, oh, you know, this is Islamophobia, for example, one of the main problems is that it uses this shield of Islamophobia to prevent criticism, right? And the reality is that it isn't, you're not talking about Islam in the sense of, you know, like a spiritual faith. We're not talking about, you know, more than almost 2 billion people. Well, we don't know what the percentage, at least 75% of them who practice their faith peacefully. We're talking about the extremism. We're talking about fundamentalism. We're talking about Islamism. And the difference between that is that it isn't just about, you know, prayer and faith and spirituality. That is a political ideology that believes in expanding itself across the Middle East and the entire world, and inflicting as many casualties as necessary to achieve that. And that thing, that political Islam, which is called Islamism, that is something that must be criticized. It must be. If you care about everyone's right to practice their own faith, you saw that they just killed 22 people in Syria in a church. They killed 22 Christians because they said this land must only be Islamic land. That is something that must be criticized.
So I want to ask you this because I feel like you're so much more informed about this, obviously because of your family and people that you know, and you coming from Iran. Like, what is the difference between the two? Because I often feel like Islam is this, and people who are peaceful are not practicing Islam the way it's mentioned in the Quran. Now, I could be wrong, but the extremists, in my opinion, are like orthodox. And the people who are peaceful are saying, we are not going to go that far because we're not going to be able to exist in any of these peaceful countries. Am I accurate or am I off?
No, you're absolutely right. I think this is sort of one of the central issues, is that, you know, sometimes people try to divide these things. There's peaceful Islam, which is practiced by the majority of Muslims, and then there's this extremism of Islamism, which is political Islam, which is expansion, which is all of these things. But the problem is that Islamists, the people who are these political, behind this political Islam, they're people who say, actually, no, we are the ones that are interpreting the Quran correctly. This is exactly what we're supposed to do. We are supposed to spread Islam everywhere. It is required of us. So I understand exactly what you're saying, because within these two factions, there is also this internal disagreement where peaceful Muslims are like, this is what Islam is supposed to be. And the extremists say, no, this is what Islam is supposed to be. But I think it's less relevant. It's less relevant what it is or what it's supposed to be. And I think what's more relevant is the fact that this extremism does exist and it just shouldn't be tolerated.
And we see that extremism, at least in theory, of the concerns of the extremism with all the terrorist activity Hamas is doing, in my opinion, subjugating and occupying Gaza against the will of probably most people in Gaza. And then also we see the conflict in Iran. I want to talk to you about those two subjects, because from what was told to me in my notes is that you are a person who is supportive of Israel and you understand the conflict that's going on in Iran from being an Iranian or from Iran, and also the conflict that's going on in Gaza. So what's your thoughts on Israel's approach to the Islamic terrorists and the threat of Islam from Iran and also from Hamas and Gaza?
So it's really important to see all of these things as connected. And since October 7th, this is exactly what I've been trying to show people. So let's just start with the Islamic Republic that's in Iran now. Okay, so this regime comes to power in 1979 through a revolution. And once this regime is established, it tells us that its foundational doctrine is to America, to Israel, and a desire to expand and export its revolution out to the rest of the world. So the entire world would be under something that's called, well, either a caliphate or an emirate. So this is it's another way of saying that the whole world would submit to Muslim rule. So in furtherance of it's something that's called velayat faqih. The Islamic Republic system is called velayat faqih. So in trying to export that out to the Middle East and the rest of the world, they engaged these proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, like Houthis in Yemen, right? And one of the main things that they need to achieve before they can establish this domination is the eradication of Israel, because Israel is the one Jewish state that disrupts the Islamic hegemony in the region, right? How are you gonna bring this entire Islamic region where you have this tiny Jewish state that's a huge problem? So, and just like they say to the United States, because that's a huge problem to expand to the West, right? So their entire objective has been to destroy this Jewish state. That's why they created Hezbollah right on the border of Israel in Lebanon, and they have Hamas in Gaza right on the other border, right? And then you have the Houthis in Yemen, and they're all firing at Israel. And so because the Western world has no idea who the Islamic Republic are and what their objective is, they look at this war in Gaza, which is obviously devastating. It's obviously horrible. So many innocent lives lost, but they don't understand why this is happening. They don't understand that Hamas is intentionally burying itself in civilian populations. They don't understand that this is a war that's very existential, not just for Israel, but for the Middle East and the world.
I'm glad you said that, because you kind of brought it in perspective for me, because it makes sense now why this is such a big issue and why Israel is fighting so hard against this. And I feel like in the West and in America, people are, and in my opinion, they're thinking that Israel will just have this this idea of trying to dominate the region, and they're doing it for nefarious reasons, when what you articulated is very clear to me, that they're trying to surround Israel. And there's been plenty of wars that have been fought proxy, and also Iran and Israel and Syria and Israel and all these wars that have been fought. And it makes sense because they are this little bitty country that's keeping, I guess, this Islamic terrorist group from containing the region, owning the Mediterranean Sea, and having all of that access. And it's interesting that you said that. So with that being said, what's your opinions on America's involvement in Iran? Because I think that we should be helping Israel, and Israel has done their part, and we helped them finish the job because that's in the best interest of us.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so and let me just back up what you're saying. When people say, oh, Israel is some whatever, they think that they want to take over the entire Middle East, whatever. You have to look at Israel's history and see how many times it has engaged in peace treaties with other countries. Like, for example, during the Six-Day War, you had 5 Arab countries declare war on Israel. Again, it's always just defending itself from this constant threat. And then it ends up making peace with Egypt and returning the Sinai. It has peace treaties with the UAE, with other Arab countries, with Bahrain. It's always looking to make peace, except in the instance that it's constantly under attack by multiple actors at the same time, right? People are like, look how many wars Israel has started. Hamas started the war on October 7th. Hezbollah fired next on October 11th. Then come in the Houthis, right? And it's constantly under this barrage of attacks by the primary backer as well, which is the Islamic Republic in Iran. And for some reason, people can't see this. In terms of your question about the US's involvement, look, we haven't even got to this conversation, but the people in Iran are against the regime. Statistically, the overwhelming people, more than 81%, 85% of Iranians are against the regime, and they've been protesting and fighting for freedom for years. For some reason, nobody has anything to say about that because, of course, it's Islamophobic to criticize a regime that's hanging them from cranes. Like, what century are we in? What century are we in that every single day Iranians are being hanged for dissent? This is medieval torture. They're shooting out their eyes. They're being raped. It's so insane that anybody just has nothing to say about that, but they have so much to say about everything else. So there's two different interests when you talk about the US involvement. There's obviously the interests of the US and the Western world, which is to erase this nuclear threat, right? From a regime that's constantly saying to America and to Israel. And from that perspective, Israel has been fighting America's war for a long time by acting as a buffer against all these Islamist jihadist groups, right? Because once Israel's down, obviously America's next. And so I think, in terms of the US's best interest, it's obviously in the best interest of the US to contain that nuclear threat, hands down. And anybody who says otherwise, I mean, at this point, it's just suicidal. In terms of the Iranian interest, because they want to get rid of this regime, their hope, obviously nobody wants war, nobody likes war, it's scary, it's dangerous. But what they hope is that the regime would be so weakened by all of these strikes that they can topple the regime themselves and have, a democratic government in its place.
And that's exactly what I've seen from people that speak on behalf of Iran, because they can't talk. They are state-run media. You better not dissent from the government. So I have seen and heard almost through the grapevine or vicariously through other people that understand what's going on in Iran, is saying that they are actually hopeful that things go south with the government so that they can have or elect the people that they want to be liberated. The crazy thing to me is that all the people in our country, in America, that are crying liberation, 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 they don't want the people of Iran to be liberated. They don't want the women of Iran. I watched a video the other day of a woman, and I can't verify this because I never lived in Iran, but she was saying that if she were to catch her husband in the act, violating their marriage vows, if you know what I'm saying, and she were to kill her husband, she would be killed, put to death. If he caught her cheating and he killed her, nothing would happen. And she also went through and said that women, if they violate certain crimes, and it's pretty much anybody, but women specifically, if they violate certain crimes and they're guilty and they're sentenced to be hung, that if they're a virgin, they can't hang a virgin. So they have to take advantage of her first, rape her, and then hang her after that. And the barbarism of just thinking about that existence should be enough for people in the West to say, no, I hope to God that we stopped them from getting a nuclear weapon. And I hope that we don't have to fight the war, but I hope that they do have a regime change, which is what Trump said. But I want to hear your thoughts on anti-Semitism, because I used to think that anti-Semitism was like racism, right? And in part, it's like that to a certain degree. I mean, people overuse it, right? Everything is racist, then nothing is racist. Everything is anti-Semitic. But nowadays, I'm starting to see from a lot of conservatives, from a lot of other people who are pundits on television, who are having or displaying what I believe is true anti-Semitism, which is this blind hate for the Jews. So what's your thoughts on anti-Semitism? Do you think it's legit? Do you think there's some there
Yeah,
there?
yeah. Yeah, oh God, I think so much. I mean, I honestly, when I started speaking up about this on October 7th, I'm such a sort of nuanced and detail-oriented person. I'm not the person that jumps in to say like, oh, racism, this. And so a lot of Jews kept saying to me, this is all about anti-Semitism. And I was like, I'm sure it's not all about anti-Semitism, but the more I dug and dug and dug, I was turning over every single rock, every single stone. And then by 6, 7 months in, I was like, oh my God, this is really just all anti-Semitism. And when you look at the patterns throughout history, where we are right now is so scary because it mimics exactly every pattern in history before the worst case scenario. It's the same thing that happened in Nazi Germany. You had this regime that was like, everything is, the fault of the Jews, everything is the fault of the Jews. And then people rallied behind this regime and it ended up being in World War II. And so now you're seeing a very, very similar trend where we have, the social justice warriors and the humanitarians of our time being so anti-Israel that they're now linking arms with terrorists and jihadists and extremists because they're freedom fighters that are resisting the Jews. And so what we're seeing is exactly what's always happened in all of history. You are now allying with the worst humans on earth because you're so anti-Semitic at this point, and you think that that's why they say it's first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people, right? Because what you do is that you bring these jihadists in by saying, they're freedom fighters, resistance, whatever, and then they kill the Jews, and guess what? They're going to kill you next too, because they don't care about Christians either, and they don't care about any other religion. So what my primary fear of anti-Semitism is, yes, number one, it is a death cult that seeks to kill Jews, but it's also a death cult that kills us all next. And this is exactly what wokeness has turned into, which is why I call it inclusive terrorism.
Right. I'm glad you said that. You make so much sense. I almost feel like you put this stuff together so well and more eloquently than I can. You are 1,000%. I used to think that anti-Semitism was just blown out of proportion. I'm like, yeah, everything's anti-Semitic. It's not about people. People
Yeah.
cannot like Jews, and it's nothing wrong. People don't like groups, and they have their reasons. But then I started I think it's almost like I say people get bit by the anti-Semite bug. That's what I say because it
It's a
seems like
virus.
yeah, it goes down a path, right? It starts with questioning one thing, which is reasonable, right? I mean, it's reasonable to question
Right.
Benjamin Netanyahu. It's reasonable to question
Right.
how much money we give Israel and making sure that we're being stewards over the money that our taxpayers are paying. It's reasonable, but it doesn't stop there. It goes from
Exactly.
that to now the Jews run the world. Now the
Hmm.
Jews killed JFK. Now the Jews faked the moon landing. You know, it's like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
before you
yeah.
know it, I heard somebody say the other day that the Jews were responsible for slave trade in Western Africa. Like the actual slave trade that brought slaves to America. The Jews ran the
Yeah.
slave trade. And I'm just like, and then it goes down and then it becomes this lie. Because I researched and I wrote an op-ed about it. People were saying the Ashkenazi Jews have no association to the line
The
of Abraham.
Khazaris theory. Yeah.
Right, yeah, the czar's theory, which was a hypothesis and not even really a fact based
Hmm.
research. And there has
Hmm.
been genetic research and studies that have been done in 2010 and 12, and there was a couple peer review articles that I put in my op-ed that shows very clearly that they do have a lineage back to Abraham, and that it's a little watered down because of the marrying outside of the race and conversions and stuff that came from that region, but they do have a line.
Obviously, yeah.
So
Of
to say that they
course.
don't is the beginning of saying that they're illegitimate, illegitimizing Israel.
Exactly. You're so exactly right. And do you know what I was thinking this today? I was thinking about, I mean, this is going to sound really, just take this how you want it. IQ is a bell curve. Okay, it is a bell curve, and statistically, most people are not highly intelligent people, and highly intelligent people look behind the curtain. They look below the surface, and they start digging, and they start realizing these things. But the problem is, most people don't do that, and so most people are so easy to brainwash because they just take something that's right in front of them and they believe it. And it's really interesting because this book that I'm talking about, it actually outlines all of this and exactly what you're saying as well, because the pattern throughout history, whether it's, you know, the Marxists, the Soviet Union, Stalin, Lenin, Mao, or Hitler, whoever it is, right? Even Khomeini in Iran, the pattern is that they front as these sort of humanitarians who care about oppressed people, and then they find an enemy, and the enemy is always the Western world. It's always Israel, it's always the United States, it's always the Jews. And they use this scapegoat. And by putting everyone's focus on this scapegoat, look how bad the Jews are. The Jews killed JFK. The Jews did this. The Jews did this. And then they give this these conspiracies this legitimacy. And then people start to look at them as the saviors of the oppressed and the truth bearers and all of this stuff, and then suddenly you find yourself in the hands of communists and jihadists, and you have no idea how you got there, but you got there because of that line of anti-Semitism that they dangled in your face, right? So this whole, the thing about anti-Semitism, yes, it's racism, it's bad, it's all of that stuff, but it's more than that. It's like a deadly ideology that destroys society because people are so simple-minded that they just go for it.
I wonder, is it a spiritual thing, or is it's just how gullible people are, and once they spread something, it becomes viral? Because I often wonder, is it a spiritual thing? It's biblically prophesied that some of these things would happen, and that the people of Israel would be scattered around, and then they would be brought back to the homeland, and these things were prophesied. In the hatred of Jews, I think that may have been prophesied as well. I don't know specifically where it's at, but do you address that in the book? Because I don't understand what it is, because I do think people really believe what they're saying. I have talked to people who are anti-Semitic, and I don't think they know it. I think they're genuinely feeling a certain way about Jewish people, and they're like, but then they don't realize they're conflating Jews, right? Because you have religious Jews and you have secular Jews, and they just lump every Jew into the same realm, and it's weird to me. What were you going to say?
So yeah, it's an ethno-religion. So it's, people are Jewish by ethnicity, as in, you know, they do a DNA test and it'll say like 99% Ashkenazi Jew, but it's also a religion. So yeah, there's it can be across the spectrum. What I was going to say is the way that I've discussed this in my book, less from a spiritual perspective, more from a sort of philosophical perspective. There's a man named Rene Girard who I think offers a good perspective on the whole thing with anti-Semitism. So what he describes by looking at each iteration in history, he comes up with this theory called mimetic rivalry. So what mimetic rivalry is that in every society, there are, let's say, two factions, or could be more, that are competing against each other. So let's say in the US, there's the left and the right, or even on a more global scale, the East and the West, right? Mm-hmm. And then so what happens is that this rivalry and this tension just increases more and more and more and more over time. And then by the time it's reached a boiling point, the only resolution is violence towards the other side. But both sides understand that this would bring down the destruction of society. So what they sort of inherently or intuitively decide is that they need to project all of that anger and violence onto a scapegoat, so that both sides can become united and sort of dissipate that anger by projecting it all onto the scapegoat and then killing the scapegoat. So that is a pattern that has emerged over throughout history, right? And because Jews have always been the convenient scapegoat because they never had a land to protect themselves. And so what's really interesting now is the way that we're seeing this actually play out so well, where we see now the extreme left and the extreme right, who have been at each other's throats for God knows how many years in the US, now come together and say, we both hate the Jews and we both hate Zionists, because they're relieving that tension that would have otherwise resulted in violence. And then you're seeing it even at a global scale, because the West and the East have forever been at war. But now the East, the jihadists and the leftists in the West are now uniting and saying, we also both hate the Jews. And so this is just a collective tension release of all of these rivalries scapegoated onto the Jews.
It makes so much sense the way you said it too, because it makes sense biblically, because that's what the scapegoat is all about. You put the sins on, put everybody's sins onto the scapegoat, and then you obviously You run it out of the city. Sometimes they
Exactly.
sacrifice the scapegoat, and that's what the term came from, and it makes sense. And I just wish that it wasn't that case, because I've been to
Mhm.
Israel. I'm sure you've probably been to Israel before,
Yeah.
and I just it's very simple. The Israeli people are just like any other people in the world. They have good people, they have bad people. Generically speaking, if you go to Israel, it's a safe place, it's a welcoming place, it's a fun place, it's a place with a rich amount of history. To be
Yeah.
honest, it is very accepting of Islam, and it's accepting of Palestinians, because when I was in Jerusalem, it was literally 50-50. I mean, Palestinians and Israelis
Yeah.
are walking around with each other in Jerusalem. When I went to Tiberias, when I went to well, not in the Dead Sea, because that's one of the places where Jews and Palestinians don't converse, like they don't go that way. But it was a
Mhm.
lot of other places where it seemed to be very accepting and peaceful. And I don't know why people can't just stick with that. Even if the
Yeah.
government does something poor or does something, untoward, that's the same thing that America does. We do stuff we weren't supposed to do as the
Exactly.
government. You don't say, I hate America. You go like, no, I love
Well,
Americans,
they
but
do say that.
yeah, they do. They definitely do. And I think some of the people, and to be honest, I think some of the people in America that claim to be patriots are starting to turn on their own country.
Exactly. And this is it's the craziest thing that the people that say America first are now the ones that are blaming America for everything. And it's so, this is what I always talk about, right? I always talk about ideological subversion. And it's the same master plan that came from the Soviet Union that is now being replicated by the jihadists. The plan was always to convince Westerners to hate themselves so much that they would tear down their own society and create a power vacuum for them to step in. And it's so unbelievable because the whole ideological subversion campaign from the Soviets was literally decades and decades of flooding us with all of this misinformation and anti-Westernism, which they would call, oh, this is anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism. Meanwhile, they were the biggest imperialists in the world. It was all just a grift, right? And the Islamic Republic, the jihadists are doing the same campaign where they're trying to convince, through subversion, they're trying to convince the Western world to hate themselves. And so when people come out and they're like, the West is the source of all evil, the US is the source of all evil, it's like, have you ever left the US to know how much evil there is out there? Do you like, you want to talk? The US is one of the best places in the world for liberation, for freedom, for free speech, for freedom of religion. You people wouldn't last a single day in Afghanistan or Iran. And the way that they talk about the Western world is so unbelievably out of touch. It's just, and they don't see that the way that they're talking about it is actually going to bring, like, it's going to bring harm over time, because you're collapsing our values, you're collapsing the values of the liberal democracies that we have by supporting people who don't like free speech, who don't like freedom of religion, who don't like any of these things.
I really wish that we can fix this to some degree, because I do see your point. I mean, the infighting is here. These leftist
Yeah.
lunatics that are on campus, they hate Jews, they hate America. And then it's sad because some of the people on the conservative side are beginning to turn on America over Israel. And they begin to, say negative things about Donald Trump and that he's bad because he's supporting Israel to a certain degree. And I'm afraid that those two factions could come together a lot closer than they should. We are not the same. Gazans, a lot of them may be good people, but Hamas is an evil terrorist organization. And we know their
Exactly.
tactics. We know how they fight dirty. They literally still have people that are kidnapped at this point. They still have people in their country kidnapped. And we know that they hide under buildings and they put their citizens out there. And we know that
Exactly.
a lot of those citizens potentially would die for the cause, right? They would say, I'm a martyr for my faith, and I'll
Yeah.
stand in this building, or I'll stay behind when the evacuation notice is had, because this is going to further help us in the long run and help the faith in the long run. They will die for their faith.
Yeah.
Suicide bomb. I mean, you name it. And Iranians will, and not Iranians, but I say the regime in Iran
Yeah.
will do the same thing. And I
Of
don't know why
course. Of
people are
course.
getting tricked by
Yeah.
this.
I think, and this is exactly the point when you're talking about people being tricked by this, because you know, clearly you can see, right? Clearly you can see this, but there's also a narrative that has been constructed, and this is why I just keep talking about the same thing. There's a narrative that has been constructed to frame everything opposite to how it is. So when it comes to Hamas's ideology and its objectives, it clearly states that its objective is to create an Islamic caliphate across the entire Middle East. It's not just about destroying Israel, it's about destroying every sovereign nation's borders so that it can, you know, impose its Islamist rule. And so what we are seeing with the world believing this idea that these are freedom fighters who just want liberation for Gazan people. Well, sorry, why have you sacrificed tens of thousands of Gazans if it's liberation that you're looking for? But when we go back, right, when you go back into history and you see the way that this narrative has been constructed, like, for example, Yasser Arafat of the PLO, right? Okay, well, let me just go back and say this because I always love to bring up this quote. During the time of mandatory Palestine, when Jews were trying to establish the state, Ernest Bevin, who was basically, you know, he was there in the position of overseeing the mandate. He returns and he says, in Palestine, there are 600,000 Jews that want to establish a Jewish state. And there are 1.2 million Arabs whose sole objective is to make sure that the Jews don't establish a state. So it wasn't that this side wants a state and this side wants a state. It's that Jews want a state and the Arabs of the land don't want them to have a state. But that narrative isn't appealing, right? So what happens is that the Soviet Union trains Yasser Arafat on how to make the narrative appealing. And he says, you need to stop saying that you're trying to destroy the Jews. You need to switch the narrative to say that you are the freedom fighters and it's the Jews that want to destroy you. So you see these decades and decades of narrative construction. Zionism was originally a liberation movement. You saw Jews being gassed to oblivion in Europe. They were being kicked out of the entire Middle East. They were the biggest global refugees in the world, and they had no choice but to return to their ancestral homeland. You can't call that anything but an attempt at survival. But the propaganda campaign turned that all into the Zionists are the murderers, the killers, the this and the that, and anyone who opposes them is resistance and freedom fighters. So what we're actually now looking at in the world, it's so much bigger than the Middle East. It is the way that these disinformation campaigns are controlling the public's perception of things that we can clearly see are right in front of us. And we don't know what to do because nobody else can see it.
That you couldn't be more correct. That's crazy. I almost feel like I'm learning so much just by listening to you. Like I feel like the dots are going poop, 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 poop.
Right?
It's making so much sense. It is a propaganda scheme because we do know. I mean, everybody that's aware knows that it's not a two-state solution that the Palestinians want. They want to from the river to the sea.
And they say it.
They say it, they chant it. The chants don't come from nowhere. They chanting stuff that is objectively what they actually believe. And then here's the other thing. Every debate I've ever had on college campuses where somebody said free Palestine, it always leads to the genocide of Jews. Because I say free Palestine, okay, what does that look like? And they're saying, well, we're being occupied. I say, well, you're being occupied. Oh, this is a genocide. Gazans are in an open air prison. I say, well, how do you get out of that? And it's really to genocide Jewish people. And then they go and you talk to them enough and they go, Hamas is a freedom fighting organization. And it's like, how do you say organizations of freedom fighting when they've taken so much money and aid and resources, deprived the people of Gaza to build compounds and rockets and all of this stuff underneath the city? And then they go out and they don't do it diplomatically. They don't go out and attack the IDF. They go out and kill and butcher and record the murder and slaughter of innocent people, then take people hostages, not military personnel, not men of military age. They got women, children, elderly, and they still have them hostage.
And this is exactly what goes to the point. And I remember in the beginning of this, people would say things like, oh, clearly you don't care about Gazans, you don't care about Palestinians. And it's like, no, it's because I care that I say this. And it's the exact reason why I say the the exact same thing that I'm saying about Gaza is what I say about Iran. That's my country. That's my people. Is that not evidence of how much I care? That I know that these terrorists are the ones that are ruining their lives. And you said it exactly right, because it starts with Free Palestine, which is the Trojan horse, right? Free Palestine is the Trojan horse that then brings in with it, oh yes, the terrorists are freedom fighters and all of that. And then you ask them, like you said, you ask, well, what should be done? And they say, oh, you know, remove the occupation from the West Bank, whatever, whatever. And you say, well, actually, you know, not long ago, it was not long ago that terrorists broke out of the West Bank, if you remember, and started shooting at random in Israel, and they killed a mother who was shielding her baby and all that. So then you say, okay, but we know that if you take away any barriers, that there's going to, objectively true, because we've seen it, that there's going to be tons of terrorism in Israel. So then what do? And then they moved the goalpost to exactly what you said. Israel shouldn't be there in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So the conversation always starts with, all we're saying is free Palestine from the occupation, blah, 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 blah. And then when you realize that there's no way to do that, because these aren't people that want peace with Israel. I'm not talking about the entire, there are people that want peace with Israel, but even if you have 99% of them that want peace and 1% that wants to kill them, there's no options, because how do you know who that 1% is, right? And that's why they destroy it for everyone. So the whole point is, you're exactly right, because the concept of free Palestine cannot end in anything other than the destruction of Israel. And that is why when people are always like, oh, you're just saying it's anti-Semitic to say free Palestine, it's not necessarily anti-Semitic to say free Palestine. It's just that the end result of what you're asking for kind of is anti-Semitic, right?
Right. Because, and I'll say this and I'll end it, because I know you got some other things to do, but like, free Palestine should be free Palestine from Hamas, free
Exactly.
Palestine from jihadists and people who don't want peace, because there are Palestinians that don't want that. They want peace. They want to be able to work in Israel and be able to live their own life. So free Palestine should be free Palestine from them, not free Palestine from Jews, to be quite honest. So where can we find you on social media? You know, your social media handles. Are you on YouTube? You know, do you make daily content? Can you just tell my audience, because you are one of my new favorites now, and I want to follow you. So I know other people would. So how can we follow you on social media?
So on Instagram and X, I'm Elica Le Bon, ELICALEBON. I'm not currently making content on YouTube, but I'm doing these interviews, so you can find tons of them on YouTube, and eventually I'll get to doing a podcast, but I'm currently writing my book, which is my focus. Then after that, I'll be doing some YouTube content. But for now, I've got a lot of great interviews like this one.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Elica. I really appreciate it. What a great conversation. I got to have you back, and anything you need from us, we're supportive. And I just really appreciate you standing strong. I know you're getting a lot of hate like I'm getting it, but just hang in there and keep telling the truth.
Thank you. And I'll definitely be back. Thank you for having me.